Life has a way of creating the most beautiful stories in the most ordinary places. This one begins at Pearl's Diner, a small family restaurant sitting on the corner of Oak Street and Main, right where the busy part of town fades into the quiet neighborhoods. The building wasn't much to look at, just a worn-down brick structure with slightly faded letters on the front and windows that had seen better days. But inside, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Mrs. Chen had been working at Pearl's for almost 15 years. Her regulars knew her as the waitress with the gentle smile and eyes that sparkled when she laughed. She wasn't tall, but she moved through the diner with the kind of confidence that came from knowing every squeaky floorboard and every regular customer's usual order by heart. It was on those quiet afternoons, just after the lunch rush had died down, when she first noticed them. 3 teenage boys would walk in, always together, always around 3:30 p.m. every Tuesday and Thursday. They carried backpacks heavy with books, and their shoes showed signs of many miles walked. You could tell they came from homes where money was tight. Their clothes were clean but well worn, with the kind of careful mending that spoke of parents doing their best with what they had. The boys would always sit at the same booth, the one near the window with the slightly torn cushion that Mrs. Chen had covered with a cheerful red patch. She watched how they would carefully empty their pockets, counting out coins and small bills on the table with serious faces. They'd spend several minutes studying the menu, even though they probably knew the prices by heart, whispering among themselves and doing quick calculations. What caught Mrs. Chen's attention wasn't just their careful counting, it was their impeccable manners. They always said please and thank you, kept their voices low, and cleaned up after themselves better than most adults did. Sometimes they'd split a single plate of fries between the 3 of them, but they never complained. Instead, they'd sit there doing their homework, making those fries last as long as they could. The oldest boy, probably around 16, always seemed to be looking out for the other 2. He'd often push more fries toward his younger friends, claiming he wasn't that hungry. The middle one was the quiet thinker, always with his nose in a book, while the youngest had a bright smile that could light up the whole diner, even on the rainiest days. Other customers would come and go, the bell above the door chiming steadily as the afternoon wore on. The smell of coffee and fresh-baked pies would drift from the kitchen, and the old ceiling fans would spin lazily overhead, but those boys remained in their corner, making their modest order stretch as long as possible. Mrs. Chen noticed how they'd stare longingly at the plates of burgers and meatloaf that passed by their table. She saw how they'd inhale deeply when she walked past with someone else's full dinner order, trying not to be obvious about it. But what really got to her was catching them looking at their homework through tired eyes, clearly hungry but determined to keep studying. The diner had its share of regulars, the morning coffee crowd, the business lunch folks, and the Sunday after-church families. But there was something different about these boys. Maybe it was the way they carried themselves with dignity despite their circumstances, or how they seemed to look out for each other like family. Whatever it was, Mrs. Chen couldn't help but feel drawn to their story. She'd been working there long enough to know that sometimes the most meaningful chapters of our lives start on the most ordinary days. As she watched them that afternoon, carefully dividing their small order and encouraging each other over their homework, she had no idea that she was about to become part of a story that would change not just their lives, but hers as well. The autumn sun was starting to cast long shadows through the diner's windows, and the day was winding down like any other. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow would be the day Mrs. Chen decided to do something that would set in motion a chain of events nobody could have predicted. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest decisions, and in this case, it all began with 3 hungry boys and 1 waitress who decided to listen to her heart. The day everything changed started like any other October afternoon, except the sky had opened up with a kind of rain that makes everything look like a watercolor painting. The streets outside Pearl's Diner were slick with water, and every time the door opened, the sound of rain would rush in along with another dripping customer seeking shelter. Mrs. Chen was wiping down tables when she heard the bell chime. Sure enough, it was her 3 boys, soaked to the bone but still clutching their backpacks protectively to keep their books dry. Their shoes squeaked against the linoleum as they made their way to their usual booth, leaving small puddles in their wake. "Sorry about the water," the youngest one said softly, already reaching for some napkins to clean up their trail. His voice had that scratchy quality that often comes before a cold, and Mrs. Chen noticed how he kept pulling his thin jacket tighter around himself. She brought them some extra napkins and watched as they went through their usual routine of counting coins. But today was different. The youngest one's hands were shaking slightly as he counted, and she could hear his stomach growling from where she stood. The oldest was pushing all his coins toward the middle of the table, but even combined with the others, it wasn't adding up to much. Then she heard it, a whisper so quiet it was almost lost in the sound of rain beating against the windows. "Haven't eaten since yesterday's lunch," the youngest one murmured to his friends. "Mom's paycheck doesn't come until Friday." The other two boys exchanged worried looks. The middle one closed his textbook and started to reach for his backpack, probably to look for any forgotten snacks. The oldest was already sliding his share of coins toward his younger friend, insisting he wasn't hungry anyway, though his own stomach betrayed him with a loud growl. Mrs. Chen had seen enough. Something in her heart shifted, like a key turning in a lock. Without a word, she walked back to the kitchen and grabbed 3 plates. Joe, the cook who'd been there even longer than she had, looked up from the grill with a knowing smile. He'd seen those boys too, and somehow he knew exactly what she needed before she even asked. 3 specials coming right up, he said, already reaching for fresh meat and potatoes. Extra portions. While the food was cooking, Mrs. Chen brought them each a large hot chocolate topped with whipped cream. The looks on their faces when she set those mugs down, it was like she'd given them gold. They started to protest, fumbling with their collected coins, but she waved them off. "It's for cleaning up the water," she said with a wink. "Best floor wipers I've had all day." The youngest one's eyes welled up a bit, but he quickly blinked it away and wrapped his cold hands around the warm mug. When she returned with 3 plates piled high with meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh rolls, the boy's eyes went wide. "There must be some mistake," the oldest started to say, but Mrs. Chen cut him off gently. "The mistake would be letting good customers go hungry," she said firmly. "Besides, we need honest opinions on Joe's new recipe. Consider it a favor to the diner." It wasn't true about the new recipe, but it gave them a way to accept the kindness with dignity. The transformation was immediate and beautiful to watch. As they ate, color returned to their cheeks and their shoulders relaxed. The youngest one took his first bite and closed his eyes, savoring it like it was the finest meal in the world. The middle one kept trying to eat slowly to make it last, but hunger won out over restraint. The oldest seemed to relax only after making sure the other 2 were eating their fill. Other customers in the diner pretended not to notice, but Mrs. Chen caught several of them smiling behind their menus. Old Mr. Thompson, who always sat at the counter, quietly paid his bill with extra money that day, telling her to use it where it's needed. As the boys ate, they began to talk more freely. Mrs. Chen learned that they had been studying for a big history test between classes and during lunch period, which explained the missed meal. They were determined to maintain their honor roll status, seeing education as their ticket to a better future. The rain continued to pour outside, but inside Pearl's diner, something warm and wonderful was taking root. It wasn't just about the food. It was about being seen, being cared for, being treated with dignity. Mrs. Chen had crossed an invisible line, transforming from observer to participant in their lives. When they finished eating, the boys tried one more time to pay, emptying their pockets completely. Mrs. Chen took 1 penny from the pile. "For good luck," she said, and pushed the rest back. "Today's meal is on the house. Tomorrow you can tell me how you did on that history test." As they gathered their things to leave, the rain having finally slowed to a drizzle, each boy thanked her with a sincerity that went far beyond ordinary gratitude. The youngest one lingered behind for a moment, then quickly hugged her before rushing to catch up with his friends. Mrs. Chen watched them leave, their steps lighter than when they'd arrived, their backs straighter. She didn't know it then, but this rainy afternoon was just the beginning. Sometimes the biggest changes in life start with the smallest acts of kindness, a hot meal, a warm drink, and the simple acknowledgement that everyone deserves to be cared for. Over the next few weeks, Pearl's Diner became more than just a place to eat for the 3 boys. It became their safe harbor, a warm spot between school and home, where they could find not just food, but also genuine care and understanding. The story of how this happened unfolded slowly, like pages turning in a well-loved book. The day after the rainy afternoon, they came back with their history test results clutched proudly in their hands. All three had earned A's, and Mrs. Chen celebrated by bringing them each a slice of Joe's famous apple pie. As they ate, the middle one spoke up for the first time about their home life. "Our moms work really hard," he said quietly, carefully cutting his pie into tiny bites to make it last longer. "Mine works 2 jobs, hospital cleaning during the day and office cleaning at night. She always makes sure we have breakfast, but sometimes lunch and dinner can be." His voice trailed off, but Mrs. Chen understood. The oldest boy nodded, pushing his glasses up his nose. "My mom's a home health aide. She takes care of elderly people. The pay isn't great, but she loves helping others." There was pride in his voice when he talked about her, mixed with a touch of worry that shouldn't belong in a teenager's voice. The youngest one added, "My mom's trying to finish her nursing degree while working part-time. She says education is the key to everything. That's why we study so hard." He pulled out a wrinkled paper from his backpack, a perfect math quiz score that he'd been saving to show his mother when she got home from her late shift. Mrs. Chen listened to their stories while going about her work, bringing them refills of water and making sure they had enough time to finish their homework before heading home. She learned that they'd been friends since elementary school, bonded by similar circumstances and shared dreams. They weren't looking for handouts, they were working hard for a better future. As autumn deepened, their visits became more regular. They'd arrive after school, usually around 3:30, and Mrs. Chen would have their booth ready. She started keeping extra supplies in her apron: pencils, erasers, even a small calculator she found at the dollar store. Sometimes they'd need help with homework, and she'd send them to talk to old Mr. Thompson, who turned out to be a retired math teacher and was more than happy to explain algebra between sips of his coffee. The diner's other regulars began to take notice too. Mrs. Wilson, who came in every afternoon for her cup of tea, once overheard the boys discussing a book they needed for English class but couldn't afford. The next day, she happened to bring in her grandson's old copy, insisting she needed to clear out space at home. Little by little, their stories came out. The oldest boy wanted to become a doctor, inspired by the kind physician who had treated his grandmother's illness without charging extra when they couldn't pay. The middle one dreamed of becoming a lawyer, determined to help families like his own navigate the complex legal system. The youngest had a gift for computers and spent his free periods helping teachers fix their technology problems. They weren't just good students, they were good people. Mrs. Chen would see them helping elderly customers with heavy trays, holding doors open, and even staying late one evening to help clean up when the diner was short-staffed. They never asked for anything in return, but their gratitude showed in countless small ways: handmade thank you cards, extra help with clearing tables, and genuine concern when Mrs. Chen caught a cold and had to miss a few days of work. One particularly memorable afternoon, the youngest one arrived alone, looking worried. His friends were homesick with the flu, and he seemed lost without them. Mrs. Chen sat with him during her break, and he confided that his mother's nursing school was harder than expected. She was struggling with some of her courses, and he felt helpless watching her study late into the night after long shifts at work. Without missing a beat, Mrs. Chen reached out to her network of regulars. By the end of the week, she had connected his mother with a retired nurse who offered free tutoring sessions. The look of pure relief and joy on both mother and son's faces when they heard the news, that was worth more than any tip she'd ever received. The boys never talked about their fathers, and Mrs. Chen never asked. Some stories need time to be told, and some don't need to be told at all. What mattered was the present, the way they looked out for each other, the way they remained determined despite their circumstances, and the way they never let hardship dim their spirits or their dreams. As winter approached, Mrs. Chen noticed they were still wearing their autumn jackets. Without making a fuss, she quietly mentioned it to Joe the cook, who mentioned it to his wife, who coincidentally worked at the department store. Soon enough, 3 warm winter coats appeared at the diner, left by anonymous donors who insisted they were just clearing out their closets. The boys knew what was happening. They weren't naive. But they've also understood that this wasn't charity. This was community. This was people recognizing their worth and investing in their future. Every act of kindness was met with doubled efforts in their studies and renewed determination to succeed. What started as a simple meal on a rainy day had grown into something beautiful and rare, genuine trust. In a world that often seemed indifferent to their struggles, they had found a place where people cared, where their dreams were taken seriously, and where kindness was served daily alongside the meatloaf special. Mrs. Chen wasn't just their waitress anymore. She had become their cheerleader, their confidant, and sometimes, when they really needed it, a stand-in mother figure who made sure they were warm, fed, and encouraged. She didn't know it then, but her simple decision to listen to her heart that rainy day would end up changing not just 3 lives, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to truly care for one another. Time has a way of flowing differently when you're watching young people grow. For Mrs. Chen, the next 2 years at Pearl's Diner passed like pages in a photo album, each memory more precious than the last. The 3 boys became as much a part of the diner as the old jukebox in the corner or the smell of fresh coffee in the morning. Every small victory was celebrated at their corner booth. When the youngest one's mother passed her nursing exam, the whole diner erupted in cheers. Joe made a special cake with congratulations written in wobbly blue frosting, and even the grumpiest customers found themselves smiling at the pure joy radiating from that corner. The middle boy, usually so quiet with his nose in his books, started to bloom. He joined the debate team at school and would practice his arguments at the diner, with Mrs. Chen and the regular customers acting as judges. Old Mr. Thompson would challenge him with tough questions, helping him learn to think on his feet. His first debate competition trophy sat proudly on the diner's counter for a whole month. The oldest one's dream of becoming a doctor took solid shape during these years. He started volunteering at the local clinic on weekends, coming to the diner afterward with stories about helping people. His eyes would light up when talking about medical procedures, using sugar packets and utensils to demonstrate how the human heart worked. Mrs. Chen started keeping medical school brochures under the counter, slipping them to him whenever a new one arrived. But it wasn't always easy. There were hard days too. Days when the youngest one would arrive with red-rimmed eyes because his mother had fallen asleep crying over bills. Times when the middle one would sit silently, struggling with the weight of responsibilities no teenager should have to bear. Moments when the oldest one questioned whether his dreams were too big, too impossible. On those days, Mrs. Chen had a special talent for knowing exactly what was needed. Sometimes it was just a hot chocolate with extra whipped cream and a listening ear. Other times, it was a stern reminder of how far they'd come and how much they were capable of. And sometimes it was simply a warm meal and the space to be quiet, to rest, to gather strength for the next day. The diner became their study hall, their meeting place, their sanctuary. During exam weeks, Mrs. Chen would keep the coffee flowing and make sure they took breaks to eat properly. She learned to read their moods from the way they walked through the door, whether they needed celebration or comfort, space or support. The regular customers became invested in their journey too. A lawyer who came in for lunch started mentoring the middle one, bringing him old law books and sharing stories from his early career. A retired nurse gave the oldest one her worn but well-preserved medical dictionary, complete with her handwritten notes in the margins. The youngest one's computer skills became so well known that he started helping fix the diner's ancient register system, saving them costly repair bills. Their mothers would sometimes stop by when they could, usually during their brief breaks between jobs. Mrs. Chen made sure these hard-working women always had a hot meal and a moment of peace. She saw in their tired eyes the same dreams she saw in their sons, the hope for a better future, the determination to make it happen, the fierce pride in their children's achievements. The boys grew taller, their voices deepened, but their respect and gratitude never wavered. They started insisting on helping around the diner whenever they could, sweeping floors, washing dishes, helping elderly customers to their cars. When Mrs. Chen tried to pay them, they refused, saying they could never repay what she'd given them. College applications became the new focus as their senior year approached. The booth became a command center of sorts, scattered with essays, drafts, and recommendation letters. Mrs. Chen watched as they filled out scholarship forms with shaking hands, hoping their hard work would be enough to open doors to their dreams. The diner's regulars held their breath with them as acceptance letters started arriving. Each envelope opened at that corner booth carried the weight of years of dreams and hard work. When the first congratulations letter arrived, accompanied by a full scholarship offer, the celebration lasted all day. By the end of acceptance season, all three had secured their paths to higher education through a combination of scholarships, grants, and their own relentless determination. Through it all, Mrs. Chen kept doing what she'd done from the beginning, believing in them, supporting them, and making sure they never went hungry. She knew their favorite foods, their greatest fears, their biggest dreams. She celebrated their successes as if they were her own children and comforted them through their struggles with a mother's understanding. 2 years might seem like a long time, but when you're watching young people transform their lives through sheer determination and the support of a caring community, it passes in the blink of an eye. What started as a simple act of kindness on a rainy day had grown into something remarkable, a testament to the power of compassion, community, and unwavering belief in the potential of young people who just need a chance to shine. Graduation day arrived with a kind of perfect June weather that feels like a gift from the universe. Mrs. Chen had never taken a day off from work in all her years at Pearl's Diner, but today was different. Today, she put on her best dress, the one she saved for special occasions, and made her way to the high school auditorium. She sat with the mothers of her 3 boys, these strong women who had worked so hard to see this day. Their eyes met in silent understanding. They had all played a part in this journey. The ceremony was long, but when each of their sons walked across the stage, the cheers from the Pearl's Diner crowd nearly lifted the roof. Old Mr. Thompson whistled through his fingers, and even Joe the cook had snuck out of the kitchen to be there. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. The boys still came to the diner, but now their conversations were full of dormitory assignments, textbook lists, and nervous excitement about the future. The youngest one was headed west to a top technology school, the middle one had earned a full ride to law school in the next state, and the oldest was starting pre-med at a university just 3 hours away. Mrs. Chen noticed how they lingered longer at the diner now, as if trying to memorize every detail. She caught them taking pictures of their booth with their phones, running their hands over the familiar red vinyl seats, breathing in the smell of coffee and pie that had become such a part of their lives. The last day they came in together was harder than anyone expected. They ordered their usual meals, but nobody could really eat. The youngest one kept wiping his eyes when he thought no one was looking. The middle one had brought a small gift for Mrs. Chen, a framed photo of the 3 of them at their booth, taken on a random afternoon when they were studying. The oldest one couldn't seem to find the right words, starting and stopping sentences until finally just standing up and hugging her tight. Mrs. Chen had prepared something too, a small care package for each of them. Nothing fancy, just some homemade cookies, their favorite candy bars, and a handwritten note she'd spent days getting just right. She'd also slipped in a small photo album filled with pictures the diner's regulars had taken over the years, candid shots of homework sessions, celebrations, and quiet moments that told the story of their time there. "You know," she told them, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, "this booth will always be yours. No matter where life takes you, you'll always have a home at Pearl's." She didn't tell them how empty the diner would feel without them, or how much she would miss their daily presence. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. The regular customers came by throughout the day to say their goodbyes. Mrs. Wilson brought them each a book for the journey. Old Mr. Thompson gave them his email address, insisting they keep him updated on their adventures. Even the grumpy morning coffee crowd had pitched in to buy them each a new backpack filled with college essentials. As the summer sun began to set on their last day, casting long shadows through the diner's windows, the 3 boys stood up to leave. They tried to pay for their meal one last time, a running joke by now, and Mrs. Chen shooed them away one last time, just like she always had. The youngest one hugged her first, whispering thank you in a voice thick with emotion. The middle one followed, pressing something into her hand, a promise to call written on a napkin. The oldest one was last, and he held them the longest, as if trying to express 2 years' worth of gratitude in one embrace. They walked to the door together, turning back one last time to wave. The bell chimed as they left, its familiar ring somehow different this time. Mrs. Chen watched through the window as they walked away, their shoulders straight, their steps confident, heading toward futures that once seemed impossible. The diner felt quieter after they left, but their presence lingered. Their booth remained their booth. Other customers seemed to know instinctively not to sit there during the after-school hours. Sometimes Mrs. Chen would catch herself looking up at the sound of the bell, half expecting to see them walk in with their backpacks and dreams. Life at Pearl's Diner continued. New customers came, regulars ordered their usual meals, and the seasons began to change. But something had shifted. The three boys had left their mark not just on the diner, but on everyone who had witnessed their journey. They had shown that sometimes all it takes is one person believing in you, one safe place to land, one chance to prove what you're capable of. Mrs. Chen kept their photo on the wall behind the counter, right next to the day's specials. When customers would ask about it, she'd smile and say, "That's a story about faith, hard work, and never giving up." She didn't know then that the story wasn't over, that the best part was still to come. Some partings aren't really endings at all. They're just the pause between one chapter and the next, the deep breath before life surprises you with something even more beautiful than what came before. As Mrs. Chen cleaned their booth that final evening, running her cloth over the familiar red vinyl, she sent up a quiet prayer for their success, never imagining how magnificently that prayer would be answered. 10 years can change a lot of things. The streets outside Pearl's Diner had been repaved, the old bakery next door had become a phone repair shop, and the maple tree that used to shade the parking lot had grown so tall it now touched the second-story windows. But inside, time had moved more gently. The same bell still chimed when the door opened, the same coffee maker still gurgled in the morning, and Mrs. Chen still moved between tables with the same warm smile. It was a busy Friday morning, the kind where coffee cups needed constant refilling and the kitchen buzzed with breakfast orders. Mrs. Chen was writing down old Mr. Thompson's usual order, though she knew it by heart, when the bell chimed. She didn't look up immediately, focused on making sure she got his A preference just right. "Be right with you," she called over her shoulder, tucking her pen behind her ear. When she did turn around, the world seemed to stop for a moment. 3 men stood in the doorway, dressed in professional attire but wearing familiar smiles that had haunted her dreams for a decade. The youngest one, now tall and confident in a crisp business suit, still had that bright smile that could light up a room. The middle one, wearing a well-tailored lawyer's outfit, held a briefcase in one hand and a folder in the other. And the oldest, her heart almost stopped, wore a white doctor's coat over his clothes, the name tag catching the morning light. For a moment, nobody moved. The regular customers looked back and forth between Mrs. Chen and the 3 men, realization slowly dawning on their faces. Old Mr. Thompson's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Even Joe poked his head out from the kitchen, drawn by the sudden quiet. The youngest one spoke first, his voice deeper but still carrying that same gentle tone she remembered. "Hi, Mrs. Chen. Got room for 3 more at the old booth." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and suddenly, they weren't successful professionals anymore. They were her boys, coming home. Mrs. Chen found herself moving before she could speak, her arms opening wide. They met her halfway, creating a group hug that spoke of 10 years of missed moments. She could feel them trembling, or maybe she was the one trembling. It didn't matter. They were here. The diner's regulars, many of whom had been there during those after-school years, began to clap. Some were wiping away tears, while others were already pulling out their phones to take pictures. Joe was beaming from the kitchen doorway, his chef's hat slightly askew. When they finally pulled apart, Mrs. Chen could see them properly. The oldest one had become every inch the doctor she'd known he would be, with kind eyes behind his glasses and gentle hands that spoke of healing. The middle one carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his voice and used it to help others. The youngest one's eyes still sparkled with that same enthusiasm, though now it was tempered with the wisdom of experience. They made their way to their old booth. No one had sat there that morning, as if the universe knew they were coming. The vinyl was a little more worn, the table had a few more scratches, but it was still their place. They slid in like they'd never left, muscle memory taking over. "We've been planning this for months," the middle one admitted, pulling out some papers from his briefcase. "We wanted everything to be perfect." Mrs. Chen started to reach for her order pad, but the oldest one gently stopped her. "Please, sit with us for a moment. We have something important to tell you." She sat, her heart racing with a mixture of joy and curiosity. The youngest one pulled out his phone and showed her pictures, their graduation ceremonies, first jobs, achievements. They'd stayed in touch with each other all these years, supporting one another through tough times and celebrating successes. The oldest one was now a pediatrician, specializing in helping families who couldn't afford medical care. The middle one had become a community lawyer, focusing on helping working families navigate the legal system. The youngest one had started a successful tech company that provided free computer training to underprivileged kids. But what touched her most was hearing how they'd never forgotten where they came from. Each of them had set up scholarship programs at their old high school. They volunteered at soup kitchens, mentored struggling students, and always made sure to pass on the kindness they'd received. "We've been blessed with success," the middle one said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we never forgot who believed in us before anyone else did." He glanced around the diner, taking in the familiar sights and smells. "This place, you gave us so much more than just meals." The youngest one was fidgeting with something in his pocket, looking nervous but excited. "We've been saving and planning for years," he said. "We wanted to do something special to thank you." The oldest one took over, his doctor's voice steady but full of warmth. "Mrs. Chen, we know you've been worried about the diner lately. We've heard about the new development plans for this area, about the rising rents." Mrs. Chen's smile faltered slightly. It was true. The neighborhood was changing, and Pearl's diner had been struggling to keep up with the increasing costs. She hadn't told anyone, but she'd been losing sleep over how long they could hold on. The middle one placed a folder on the table, sliding it toward her with gentle reverence. "We'd like you to open this," he said softly. "It's been a long time coming." The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over their booth, their special corner of the world where dreams had taken root and grown into something beautiful. Mrs. Chen looked at these three remarkable men who would always be her boys and reached for the folder, not knowing that her life was about to change just as dramatically as she had once changed theirs. With slightly trembling hands, Mrs. Chen opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, but what caught her eye first was a photograph. An old snapshot of three teenage boys sitting in this very booth, heads bent over their homework, while she stood beside them with a coffee pot in hand. The memory hit her like a wave, bringing tears to her eyes. "Keep reading," the youngest one encouraged softly, his voice full of barely contained excitement. As she turned the pages, her eyes grew wider. These weren't just any legal documents, they were ownership papers for Pearl's Diner. Not just ownership papers, but an entire business plan. The oldest one leaned forward, his doctor's demeanor gentle but enthusiastic. "We've bought the diner," he explained, "and not just the diner, but the whole building. No more worrying about rent increases or development plans. Pearl's Diner isn't going anywhere." Mrs. Chen's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely now. The middle one, speaking with the careful precision of a lawyer, continued, "But that's just the beginning. We want to transform it into something even more special, with you as the heart of it all." They laid out their vision, one that had clearly been years in the making. Pearl's Diner would remain exactly as it was, same menu, same atmosphere, same spirit of kindness. But they would add a community center upstairs, a place where struggling students could come to study, where working parents could find resources and support, where dreams could take root and grow just as theirs had. "We're calling it the Pearl Chen Community Center," the youngest one said proudly. "Because you taught us that true wealth isn't about money, it's about how many lives you touch." The other diners had gathered around now, everyone wanting to be part of this moment. Old Mr. Thompson was openly crying into his napkin. Joe had abandoned his grill completely, standing nearby with his arms crossed and a proud smile on his face. "There's more," the middle one said, pulling out another document. "We've established a scholarship foundation in your name. Every year, 3 students who show promise but need support will receive full college scholarships. They'll have mentoring, tutoring, whatever they need to succeed." The oldest one took Mrs. Chen's hand in his. "And we've set up a trust fund to ensure that no child who comes to Pearl's Diner will ever go hungry. Just like you did for us, this place will be a sanctuary for those who need it most." Mrs. Chen looked around her beloved diner, seeing it through new eyes. The worn booths, the slightly crooked counter, the old-fashioned cash register. Every scratch and dent held a memory, a story, a piece of countless lives touched over the years. But she managed to say through her tears, "This is too much." "The cost?" The youngest one shook his head, smiling. "Actually, it's not enough. We calculated every meal you gave us, every cup of hot chocolate, every piece of pie. With compound interest over 10 years, it would be far more than this. But you gave us something worth much more than money. You gave us dignity, hope, and love. The middle one reached into his briefcase one last time. We'd like you to be the executive director of the foundation, he said, sliding over yet another document. This diner will always be yours to run as you see fit, but we want you to help us find more kids like us, more families who need just a little help to change their lives. Think of it as a retirement plan, the oldest one added with a grin. Though we know you'll never really retire. This way, you can keep doing what you love, but with even more resources to help others. The morning sun had risen fully now, filling the diner with golden light. Regular customers were sharing the story with newcomers, phones were capturing the moment, and through it all, Mrs. Chen sat in that familiar booth with her 3 boys, now successful men who had never forgotten their roots. Joe appeared with a fresh pot of coffee and his special celebration cake, the one he'd made so many times for their achievements over the years. As he served them each a slice, Mrs. Chen finally found her voice again. 10 years ago, she said softly, 3 young boys walked into this diner, counting their coins to buy a meal. Today, 3 remarkable men have walked back in, showing the world what can happen when you believe in people. She looked at each of them in turn, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. I always knew you would do great things. But your greatest achievement isn't your success, it's your hearts. The youngest one raised his coffee cup. To Mrs. Chen, he said, his voice catching slightly, who taught us that the smallest acts of kindness can change the world. To Pearl's Diner, the middle one added, where dreams are born and hope is always on the menu. To the future, the oldest one finished, and to all the lives we'll touch together. As they sat there in their old booth, sharing cake and memories and dreams for the future, the bell above the door kept chiming as more people came in, drawn by the atmosphere of joy and celebration. The story of the 3 boys and the kindly waitress who believed in them was already spreading through the neighborhood, inspiring others to look around and see who in their own lives might need just a little help, just a little kindness to transform their lives. And in that moment, in that small diner on an ordinary street, the simple truth became clear. Sometimes the greatest acts of kindness aren't grand gestures or huge donations. They're the small, daily choices to see people's potential, to believe in their dreams, and to provide a safe place where hope can grow. The cycle of compassion that started with a simple meal on a rainy day had come full circle, promising to touch generations to come.